So, hi everyone, I'm Chris Saxon. I'm part of Stephen Feuerstein's Oracle Developer Advocate team. It's my job to help you get the best out of Oracle Database, hopefully have a little bit of fun whilst doing so. So with that in mind, I'm very excited to be here. First new SQL Office Hours session of 2019. As always, this is your chance to get your SQL questions answered. Got anything you want to know? Just put your notes in chat. I'll keep an eye on it. We haven't had any questions come in advance, but we did have an interesting question on the traditional text-based AskTOM come in about a month ago. So what I'm going to do is walk through that. So let me share my screen again and bring that up. So hopefully you can all see my slides now. And let's get started. Let's get going. So we had a rather interesting question. So someone wanted to do add a runnings total to their data set, but it wasn't just your kind of traditional running total of the previous rows or something like that. They had some rather interesting values that they wanted to calculate based on what's there. So what they wanted to do is look forward from each row based on the number of rows to sum. So we're starting on that first row. We want to look forward an extra 2 rows and calculate the total for those, but only where the skip flag is 0. So this is a flag to say whether or not we should ignore the row. We only include totals that are 0, and we need to include 2 of those. So if we walk through the data set that we've got, what have we got? Something like this. So we've got our first row in the data set, we've got our value of 5.5. So we want to include that in our results because we always include the value from the current row in the result set. Then we want to include an extra 2 in the total. So we need to go forward 1 to 3.5. Next is 2.5, but we don't want to include that because the skip flag there is set to 1. So we're going to ignore that row completely. We've only included 1 extra row so far. So what we need to do is include this final row here, which gives us a total of 15.5. So we do that for the first row. We then need to repeat that process for the second row. So again, we include the value for the current row and then walk through and include all those. Now note here, we're saying we got 3 rows that we want to look ahead and include in total, but actually the result set finishes when we've only found 2. So we need to include as many as possible up to this total. It's possible we might go up beyond the end of the result set and be unable to include that many. But again, we're only doing this where after the first row, the skip flag is set to 0. Do note, for the row where the skip flag is set to 1, well, it always includes its own total in it, okay? So if we look down at row 5, it's got a value of 8 because it always includes its own value, even though it's being ignored. It's just everything else before it that will exclude that value. So this is quite an interesting question because you can't just use well, at first glance, it looks like a straightforward analytics thing where you set your windowing clause, but it's a bit more complicated than that. So with your windowing clause, you can say how many rows before or after the current one you want to include in your calculation. So here in our sum. So we can actually do that dynamically. You can say, we could pass this column rows to sum in and say, look forward that number of rows. But we don't know exactly how many rows we want to look forward. So on that first one, we wanted to include 2 values, but we needed to go forward 3 rows. And in order to know that, we actually have to kind of work through the data set to try and find out what's going on. So this is kind of tricky. Now, maybe there is a way to do this using classic analytics, just building the chaining together analytic functions on top of each other. So you can say, well, we need to look forward X rows plus these ones that we've skipped and keep doing that. But that's going to get very messy. You're going to have lots of nested queries. And frankly, my mind just hurts trying to think about that. It hurts thinking about the other solutions as well. This is not obvious exactly how to do it, but it hurts even more trying to think about a classic analytic function way of doing this. So what do we do? Well, first, one solution we can look at is on 11.2, we can use recursive with. So this is where we recursively loop through all the rows. So for every row, we then work forward in the data set. So how do we do that? Well, I start off with our classic recursive subquery factoring clause. So to begin with, we're just selecting from the table itself. And I'm adding in some of these extra rows. So for each one, we want to know which was the root, which row did we commence building the tree from, the running total, and how many rows we've counted so far. How many have we included in our running total? So those two columns are going to be the interesting ones here. So that starts us off. Then we've started off our recursive query. And as I said, these value, running total and rows counted, are the interesting values, because what we need to do is say, when the skip flag is 0, increment the total and increment the counter, but only when it is 0. So we're checking this value, adding or incrementing as appropriate. Otherwise, we just return the current value. Everything stays the same. Okay, so next, we actually need to figure out the join condition. So we join them together, working through, and we stop when the rows that we need to sum has exceeded how many rows we've counted, or when they're equal. So we need to stop when we've hit our limit, when our counter's found how many we're actually looking for. So remember, we're only incrementing the counter when we find when it's a row that we should include, not one we should ignore. Okay, I see there's some question. Mark, you've got a question in chat. We can open that up to the floor a bit later and come back to that. But let's just press on with this for the minute. Okay, so that's our recursive part. Then we need to actually return the results. So there's still a step we need to do here. So for each row, we found all the following rows that we're going to include in the total. So our results set's actually going to be a lot larger than we need it to be. It's going to include n rows to sum after each one. So we need to remove those from the result set. So the last one is going to be the one that has the running total, the final running total. So we need to find that one for each starting row. So for each partition by root. So we can find that with our max function here and find the leaf, the final row for each initial row, and then just filter those out. So that gives us our result set. So this is quite a big query, right? You know, if we stick it all on one page, nice tiny font, it looks something a bit like this. So this clunky, it's a bit hard to see and tough to follow. So there's a simpler way, or at least I think a simpler way, and that involves pattern matching. Before we move on to that, anyone's got any questions or comments on the recursive solution? No, as I say, if you're feeling lost or wanting questions on this, just put them in chat and I'm keeping an eye on it. Okay, so that was our recursive solution. Let's see how we can approach this using pattern matching, which I think is a much easier, much more elegant way of solving this problem. So before we look at the SQL itself, let's remind ourselves what we're actually trying to do here. So what we need to do is count the number of rows where the skip flag is 0 after the current that are until we hit the number of rows to sum. So we're looking for a pattern. We've got our first row. That says there's 2 rows we need to include. We need to count until we reach that many where the skip flag is 0 after it. So this is forming the basis of our condition. What we need to do is count the number of rows after the current one. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we can start that in our define clause. So we're saying to sum, and we're counting how many of these values we've got. We've got these count to sum here. And when that is, we want to keep going as long as that is less than or equal to the rows to sum. So if we just stop here, then we're just going to work forward in the result set. And we're going to say, well, we want 2 rows, and we're just going to go 2 rows forwards, include those in a total, and then we stop. And that's our pattern. We found 2 extra rows to include in what we're trying to do here. So what we need to do is extend the pattern variable here to also to filter out those we want to ignore. So we also need to set the skip flag as equal to 0. Okay, so now we've got our pattern variable. It's looking for how many rows we want to sum. At this point, you might be tempted to just kind of say, okay, we want multiple of those. So we could have a pattern that looks something like this. We have an initial row. So if you've got a pattern and there's a variable here that's not listed in your define clause, it's always true. It's the universal match. So our first row will match this. Our init will get the value from the rows to column, some column from that, and then we'll just go through until we get the count. And there could be 0 of those or any number of those. So that's going to be fine, right? Well, there's a problem here. This is going to stop when it finds the row that we finds a row where the skip flag equals 1. So it will no longer match this pattern variable, this define clause. So we found our first row, we've gone to the next one, that's 0, we're fine. We go to the one after that, that's 1. Okay, so we need to stop and reset the pattern and start again from our initial thing. So how can we get around this? What can we do here? So there's one thing we can try, and that is add another variable in here, the one that is we're marking as toSkip. So these are the rows we want to bypass in our result set. All right, so how do we define that? What is that? How do we say what that really means? Well, we can define that in relation to the toSum here. So notice I'm saying that toSkip looks very similar to the initial definition of toSum. We're counting how many rows this is matched and that it's less than how many we're looking for. Okay, so we can prefix values or columns from other pattern variables we defined. So this allows us to access values from other rows in our result set. So we're saying, even though this is a new pattern variable, we'll go to a new row, we're actually looking at the value from toSum, and these two counts are going to be the same. Which one we match depends on two things. First up, whether or not it's this skip flag, but also it depends on which order they are listed in our pattern here. Okay, and this says left to right evaluation. So what the pattern does is it looks and says, okay, this next row, does it match the variable toSum? If the answer is no, then it will go and match toSkip. If we switch those around, so let's say we want toSkip and then toSum, well, what happens there? Well, what happens is we end up including every single row in the result set. Okay, why is that? Well, we've got toSkip. So what's that doing? It's saying that the count of toSum is less than how many rows there are to sum. And then the next row, well, the count of toSum has never increased. So we're always less than that, so we always include everything. So the order you list things in our pattern here does have an impact on which way around things are actually evaluated and processed. Okay, so questions or comments on that? Okay, so is this pipe symbol used in pattern matching a new type of operator? Okay, so what we've got here is a regular expression. So when you've got your pattern here, so this is good question, Sven. Our pattern uses regular expression terminology. So when we've got our star here, if you're familiar with those, that means match 0 or more cases of whatever is within this. So we're true if we've got nothing there, or we could have any number of them. So the pipe is the alternator in regular expressions. It says or. So either match this or that. No, it's no worries about your typing. You're struggling, still fingers get going. Yeah, it's because it's in parentheses, we can use the pipe. Yep, we could have any number of in here. I could also say maybe we want to do different things based on different values. So I've just said they're 1 or 0. Maybe there's 1, 0, 2, or 3, and we do different calculations based on what's in there. We can just pipe those in together. So it's the standard regular expression syntax that we all know and probably hate, but that's what we've got here. So the pipe isn't a SQL operator, it's a regular expression operator. So I hope that explains what's going on here. Okay, so we've figured out what our pattern is and what we're looking for, what we're trying to do here. next thing we need to do is say which order we are processing our data. So this is fairly straightforward. We had our row number and we're just working down in order of the row numbers. So we put that in our clause here. Next, we want to show what's in our output. So we wanted the running total of the value for the current row plus all the rows where the flag is 0. And so we need something a bit like this. So we've got our init val, the value from the pattern variable init, and then we need to sum up all the rows that match the toSum variable. Now note, I've got this MVL round here because there might be none. So if you recall, some of those rows didn't want to sum anything after them. They had 0 in there. So that will be null because we've not found anything. So we've got some null checking to do there. So this gives us a total of the rows, the current row, plus all those following rows that match the variable. Okay, so we've got that, but we've still got a problem here. So we calculated our running total, but by default, with our pattern, once we found it, we then go on to whatever the next row is. So we have got our current row. We are adding 2 rows after it, where the flag is 0. There was 1 in between, which was 1. So we've gone 4 rows down our result set. By default, pattern matching will then start again from the 5th row in the table. That's not what we want here, right? We want to calculate this running total for every single row. In order to do that, we need to add this after match skip to next row. So what that means is start at the first row, work down on a data set until we've completed our pattern, then go back up in our table to the 2nd row, repeat the process, go back to the 3rd row, repeat the process, go to the 4th row, repeat the process. So for every single row in the result set, in the input data set in the table, it's going to run through, see if we can find that pattern. If we don't do this by default, then we'll run through and just we'll bypass rows. We'll end up with some missing running totals. So with after match skip to next row, you will process the same row many times, or it's very likely you'll process the same row many times. By default, you'll process each row just once. So that's an important thing to be aware of. Okay, so at this point, we've kind of actually got more or less the results that we were looking for. But just to help show you how this works and what's really going on here, I'm also going to include the all rows per match clause. So by default, match recognize works in some ways a little bit like group by. So with group by, all the rows that fall in the same group collapse together and you get 1 in the output. Match recognize, all the rows that go into the same pattern collapse together and you just get 1 row in the output, which is quite often what you want, and it is what we'll want as the final output of this query, the final report. But to help you debug and figure out what's going on, it's really useful to have this all rows per match clause so you can see what's going on and work through and help debug really what the problem is. Okay, so we've done that, and what do we get? So we'll start off with our first row in the result set. So let's work through and see how this match recognize clause works with this. So initial row, it's always true, we match that variable, match that pattern. Then we need to work forward 2 rows in the result set. So that's our 2 over here. Go forward that many rows where the skip flag is 0. So we go to our next row and we include that in the result set. So that matches the toSum variable. Then we go to the next one. Now, this is set to skip because the skip flag is 1. So we want to bypass that row. And finally, we get to another row where the toSum is which we want to include in our sum, and we can stop now. So at this point, we can see, based on our classifier, we've got 2 rows which matched the variable toSum. So the count there of those matches our input rows, our starting rows. So we stop. Now we're done. Okay. And now, as we said, after match skip to the next row, we start again. We repeat the process, this time from the 2nd row in the data set, in the table. So again, we initialize it and we'll work through and produce the running total. As I said, in this case, there aren't actually 3. We'll hit the end of the table first, but we go as far as we can. Questions, comments on this? Is this everyone? Are people managing to follow along with this, or is this going way over people's head in terms of because match recognize does take a little bit of getting to grips with. Are people relatively familiar with this, or as Judith says, great. Okay, well, it's good to see that you're enjoying this, Judith. Either everyone else is just happy or is so blown away they're just not sure what to say at this point. Okay. All right then. So that's kind of what gave us what we were looking for. There's one other thing that I wanted to add here. So if we jump back to the query and look at what we had in the measures clause. So we had our initial value plus we're summing up all the rows that match these to some variable. And this is just kind of messy, right? We've got adding two things together. We've got to do a bit of null handling and so on. It looks messy. It's kind of hard to read. It's really easy to make a mistake. I mean, classic mistake that we'll almost certainly make, or certainly I made first time round, is not including the MVL here, right? So you end up with null in the results for a whole bunch of rows. So how can we simplify this or make this a bit easier to work with? Well, there's another clause in match recognize, a subset clause. So what we can do here is define a new variable. So this isn't one that has a, and this is based on other values. So we're saying total is the combination of init or sum. So any row which matches either of those values, so either init or toSum, also matches this variable, total variable. And we can include this. So how does that help us? Well, our sum was init plus the sum of those two sums. So we grouping those together, we can just sum that up, sum that total, simplifying our measures clause here, and get the result as there. So a little simplification function to make this work with. Okay, so Sven, I still don't see why we prefer this over an analytic function in favor of match recognize is in this case, just that we have several measures, value, sum, to count. Okay, so my challenge to you, Sven, is write this without using match recognize, okay? So if we go all the way back to what we're trying to do here right at the very start, thing is we don't know if it wasn't for this skip flag, then yes, we could just use that as say go from the current row and rows to some following. That's dead easy, nice and simple. But the problem is you don't know how many rows to look forward in advance. Okay, so I've said look forward to. If we did something like row sum of current row plus the two following, and it wasn't for this skip flag, nice and easy, very simple, and I wouldn't even be talking about match recognize. I probably wouldn't have even brought this question up. However, point is we don't know how many of these rows that we need to skip in between there is. In theory, there could be a whole massive big chain of, I don't know, 10 rows that we need to skip. But we've got this value here that says 2. So in order to pass into our windowing clause how many rows in advance we need to look forward, we then need some pre-processing to figure that out. Now, there may well be a way to do that. I can't think of an easy way of doing it. I'm sure there is a way, but the point is you're going to have to chain analytic functions on top of each other in order to do this. So, okay, whether that's better, worse, easier to understand, yeah, okay, that comes down to personal preference to some extent. Yeah. Yeah, so we're saying from this row, we want to, so these ones afterwards, these 3 at the end, they're not including anything afterwards, and that's fine. But these 3 at the start, we've got 2 rows where this skip flag is 0. And how many rows is that actually? Well, we need to go forward and count them and figure out what that is. If you find a way to do this with analytics, please share it. I'd be keen to see it. But certainly you will have to have some form of inner subquery to figure out how many rows you've got to add on top of this sum to figure that out. So any other questions or comments? with analytics, you should probably build nulls from the rows with skip flag equals 1, and then use lead n with ignore nulls to find the last row for the group. Can you expand on what you mean there, Judith? Another one of the challenges here as well is that you always need to include the value from the current row. Now, which you can just do that by looking from the next row. So take the value from the current row and then add on the sum of all the following rows. I guess you may, or maybe you could map skip flag to null and ignore those. I'm still not sure exactly how that would work. If you can anyone can find a solution or think of a way to do it, then please share us. So any other questions or comments on this before we move back? Because I saw Mark, you had a question about something there. For Niels, if there isn't the skip flag column, can we use the rows to sum in the windowing clause like rows between and rows to sum following? That's exactly what you could do, Niels, yes. And if it wasn't for that skip flag, then it would be straightforward windowing clause like that. So that's exactly what you do, Niels. Okay, so for each row, you need to look for the last row to sum for that base row, looking n rows ahead without the nulls. I think the thing is, Judith, you don't know how many n rows ahead you need to look. You know you need n where the flag is 0, but you don't know where the end point of that result set. Enhancement request. Extend the windowing clause to our out of where clause for the boundaries. Okay, that's an interesting idea. So you'd say have a select within the range where a value. So how would that work, Niels? Any other questions or comments on this or this problem? Another thing worth covering off. Some people think, well, you could partition. Okay, here's your thing. So rows between current row and rows sum following. Okay, that's an interesting idea. The n is the rows to count column. You know exactly how many rows you'll sum, but you don't know how many you'll skip. Yep, but you don't need to with the lead ignore nulls. Okay, I think I see. I'm not sure. I think I'd need to try this out and see exactly how that would work to figure out. But I guess that might work. Well, why don't we try it as we're here? I've got the example up here. Let's give it a go. Let's try it out and see how it works. Just remember which database I've got up and running. I think it's this one. Lead will give you the nth following rows with nulls skipped. So you're saying we'll have to map that to null though. So if we do skip sum and we do something like this. So hang on, let me just make sure I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so you've got my screen up, folks. Someone let me know, make sure, confirm that I've actually sharing my screen at this point, unlike last time where I completely forgot to share it. So we can say lead lead row num. Yeah. Yes. So Sven, I was thinking about using partition by skip rows, which will also ignore the skip rows equals 1, but this will be problematic for the skip rows itself. That's exactly the problem, Sven. Again, if the current row is one you need to skip, you always need to include itself in the total, which then creates problems. And of course, if the current row is one you need to skip, you'll then only be including ones that you should skip, which is completely wrong. So yeah, the partition by approach doesn't work, unfortunately, or at least as far as I can tell, it doesn't work. Okay, so lead over order by row num case when skip equals then run end. Okay, so let's see if that gives us what we're looking for. Nope, helps if I build the table, doesn't it? Okay, so let's try this out. And we can see, so for our first row, we want to get, let's order it by row number again at the end. Easier to see what's going on. Oh, helps if I get my query right, order by. So we start here and we need to go, yeah, so there's first problem is we kind of, because the current row here, we end up with a null because we got some null ones where it's 0, so we can't include them. So we need to nest our case in here. So live coding here. Okay, that's still not going to let us. We'll need to put that in our thing here. So we're saying we're looking n rows ahead. Case when rows to sum greater than 0, then rows to sum, else 1, end. Okay. Don't make nulls, but in a separate column and in inline view. Yeah, so we're gonna have to. But what value are you making null, Judith? I don't understand. I don't understand which value you're making null. Like that. So which column is it that we make null to, and which value is it we're getting? So what? Case when rows to sum equals. Yeah, lead won't give us. I think we're using lead to find how many the nth row that we need to look ahead to find which value. To find how many rows ahead we need to look. You need skip flag equals 1, then null, else row number end. Build a lead on that column, but still order by the original note. Okay, so we can do something like this. We'll call that C1. Let's make sure that that bit works. Does that bit work? Yeah, there we go. All right then. Yeah, the thing is, okay. Why is it saying from? Okay, so now we're lead rows to sum, order by C1, order by on that column, lead on C1. What have I done wrong here? From keyword not found. Line 25. Ignore nulls. That's why. Put the ignore nulls in the correct. Nope. Missing window specification. No. What have I done wrong here? Who can spot it? Who can spot my mistake? Ignore nulls. That's the right. Okay, hang on. Yes. Okay, yep. There we go. We got there eventually. So we're saying from to, okay. Okay, yes. So we know when that's out of range. Unfortunately, some of these are 0. Let's, hang on. I think we might hit this argument out of range problem every time for these 0 valued rows, unfortunately. Yeah, I think we're gonna have to try this some other time. It's a good question. Well, it's on AskTOM. It's a question on AskTOM. If you look, then you can have a look and start fiddling around with it yourself. And that's a good point. So I'll bring up the link and put it in the chat in a minute. All right then, any other questions or comments on this before we move back on to what Mark was talking about? Okie dokie. All right then, so back further up, we had a question from Mark. How do you format data cells in a pivoted report? Must be easy, but I can't figure it out. So I see you had a little bit of a chat there with Sven. So you're trying to write in plain SQL, which could then be used in SQL Dev. So could you explain what it is you're trying to format, Mark, and what you're struggling with in a bit more detail? I'll dig out that question while you give us a bit more background, Mark, on what you mean by formatting your table. Okay. I can't figure out how to identify the data cells by the name to format them. It can't be as difficult as it seems. And which cells exactly? Can you give an example query that you're trying to do? So there, I'll put in chat the question which sparked off this conversation or this discussion we had earlier about those rows to sum. It would be long. Well, can you just trim? So you've got a pivot query, yes? And then you are woo, okay. Okay, select from blah 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 blah, pivot. Yep. So you got your things that you're pivoting. Okay. Fair enough. So what is it you're trying to format, or what's the problem you're hitting with formatting? So is it accessing how to format the counts? Should be okay. So that's I mean, as Sven was saying, a lot of the time you can use your client to just do the formatting, but otherwise, if you want to do like to char call FM 9999999 something like that. Is that why is that not working? What's the issue but what are the count cells called? I'm not sure what you mean by the count cells. KNT? What are the count cells exactly? It isn't taking the table names. So you've got so in your pivot, you've got like pivot, val, and then alias. Pivot in, in val alias, something like that. And whatever you have as, I'll put this back on my screen. So if you've got a pivot function, select star from, let's say, DBA objects, pivot, now star for object type in, and then we got table view. Come on, I'm suffering fat fingers too today. View. So let's just do tables and views for now. Have I got that right? Missing comma. Where have I missed my comma? Who can spot? Once again, 140, column 13. It's not going to let me call it table. That's probably why. Keyword. There we go. So there we go. Put that in a subquery so we don't have the implicit grouping. So we do something like that. Yeah. So as Sven says, the name's in the pivot clause, so it's whatever we've given these aliases. So we've got tab, tab, and it's whatever I've called this here. If I call it tb, then that's the name it has there, and you can do your formatting on it as you would. Now you could have multiple columns here. You could have multiple functions, aggregates that you do. So what happens there? Well, that's where it gets a bit interesting. So what it will do is column ambiguously defined. Where do I? What have I missed? I've done something there. So when we do this, you can have multiple of these, and it will. That's it, because I need to give one of these an alias, mx. So we can alias what we're going to call these these columns. So now we've added that. So tab mx, tab ct. So the key point is it's whatever you've put as your alias in the pivot clause forms part of the name or the stem of the name. If you've got multiple aggregate functions, then whatever alias you give those are a suffix. Yeah, you've almost certainly got a typo in there somewhere, Mark, or something that's just not quite as you see it. It's rather than it's useful if you've got massive pivot list, then try stripping out all except a couple of options and then see what happens and reduce it down. Make the problem as small as you can, and then come back and see what you can do to resolve it. Yeah, that's the other way, Sven. Yep, just run the select star and see the column name. So is this? Yeah, all right. Okay, anyone got any other questions or comments on that, on the problem we saw earlier? Pivoting, anything else to do with SQL that you'd like to know about? It's nice having a sanity check. Yeah, it's good always to have someone double check your code, make sure that you're not doing something too crazy. Yep, thanks for sharing. So you just shared a link for Pivot. Thanks for sharing that. I've also got a rather large article on Pivot on the SQL blog, if anyone's interested in that. So okay, any other questions or comments before we wrap up? We could have a few minutes left, but there's nothing else coming in. Then Aravinda, I have an update statement. I need access the external table. Can you explain that in a bit more detail? What it is? Okay. Is this your statement that's just you're trying to do? So which is the external table? That's the problem that you're trying to update, or what exactly is the error you're getting here? So what's the problem you're bumping into, Aravinda? The CTF CODSER is not available in the subquery. Okay. CTF1. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Because I think you've nested it too many levels down. Is a subquery and a subquery? Yes. So that's a problem where you've got, once it's nested too far in, then you can't access the value out. Now, I mean, so you're trying to, update, but I still need to access the same table. Can you step back a bit and explain what the SQL statement is trying to do without talking about SQL? What's the business reason for doing this? What are you trying to achieve by running this update? It's not easy to explain in a minute. It's about to get off duplicates. So what you're trying to find. Yeah, I was going to say, Sven's saying a merge might be an alternative and maybe an analytic function instead of the grouping, so you don't need to access the same table twice. That's good suggestions, Sven. What you might be worth doing is looking into an update only merge. So these might be more effective than what you're trying to do, or might be able to solve the problem. Looking for only rows having a count greater than 1. Yep. Okay. So okay. So you just want to update the duplicate rows. So in that case, I don't. Yes. So yes, it's problem of referencing 2 levels outer. You're right. It doesn't work. So if you want to find those that find the rows where there's more than 1, then I don't understand why you need the subquery. You can just select those. The inner subquery, you can just get rid of that, can't you? Because you're looking for any rows where there's more than 1. So rather than what you've got, there's, yeah, you can, okay. Let me bring my screen up again very quickly. If I can, what's going on? So let me share my screen again. So we'll come back over here. You can still group by. You can still, let's just shrink this over. Why can't you just do, why do you need to join them? Why can't you just do this? Just have this one level of query, because you're still grouping by then, you're still grouping by all these values for this one. I don't understand why you need to do the join to itself if you're just looking for all those that are duplicates. Yeah, you're probably right, Sven. It probably can be done without grouping at all. Either way, I think we can get rid of that inner subquery. I'm not sure why specifically you need it. We could probably just collapse it down, just something along those lines. The inner group by and outer group by are not the same. Oh, you've got 2 levels of group by. All right. But, okay. I'm still a bit confused as to why you have 2 levels of grouping. You've got, yeah, much easier. Post on AskTOM, create some scripts, example demo, show us what you're trying to achieve, because I'm struggling to understand exactly what's going on by those duplicates. So create table, inserts, and the update, show us what you're trying to achieve, and we'll help you out. Okay. Anything else then? We're getting up towards the hour, so unless anyone's got any other quick comments, I think we will wrap it up for today. Maybe you can come back to this topic next time. Which one specifically, Edith? We've talked about quite a few things here. Okay, so while Judith clarifies exactly which topic she wants us to come back to. So just thank you all for joining me. Just to let you know, I'm going to be changing when we have the SQL sessions. So traditionally, they've been on the second Thursday of the month. I'm going to move them to the third Tuesday of the month. So be aware of that if you want to keep coming to these. There'll have been notifications. If you follow me on Twitter, I'll be knowing that, and the emails you get as well will announce this, so you'll know that these changes are coming. In the meantime, thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this. More importantly, hope you learned something. It's good to see you all. Have a great 2019, and I hope you learn lots of SQL. Thank you. All right, cheerio.